It started innocently enough. I was reading on the bed while my boyfriend, Charlie, was playing on the computer with his friends. I don't play many games, so it's interesting to listen to the things he says to his friends, even if the terminology goes over my head sometimes. There will be moments when I'll be focusing on something and he'll just spout off words that sound, well, extraterrestrial. I'll just laugh it off and continue with what I was doing. It wasn't my thing, but he enjoyed it, and it wasn't hurting anyone, initially. Like I said, I had my nose between the pages reading about various armchair philosophies, as Charlie raved on in the background playing Call of Duty, I think. He had won a match and swiveled his chair to face me, like a dog when they did a trick. "Finally got a win tonight," he exclaimed, more for himself than for me. "That's great, babe," I replied, offering an admittedly false smile. I was happy that he was happy, but I can't say I was invested. He turned back on the computer and was talking to his friends again. They were hyping each other up. I heard Charlie mutter, "Now that was Poggers." It was such a random word that tickled my brain when I heard it. I couldn't help but laugh. Charlie leaned back in his chair as if he was exhausted himself, and he swiveled to face me once more. "I can't believe I just said that unironically," he echoed my laughter, offering a painfully adorable smile. "I feel like I should just go wash my mouth out with soap." He repeated the word a few times, making sure to let out popping noises whenever mouthing the P. We both laughed it off, and he said goodnight to his friends. It was time for me to get some quality time with him, and with that, my book remained on the nightstand until morning. In the morning, I woke up early and felt like I had gotten a really good sleep that night. I was in a really good mood. And when I'm in a good mood, I make breakfast. I heard the stairs creak and figured the smell of bacon had lifted Charlie out of bed. He stumbled into the kitchen, his hair a complete mess. "That smells Poggers," he groggily moaned. With mild amusement, I went to laugh. Charlie's face conveyed confusion as he stood in the kitchen. His eyes strained and mouth still slightly agape. I totally meant to say great. He continued, turning his gaze to me. "God, I'm tired," he chuckled before shuffling over to help me finish up with breakfast. The rest of the day was pretty normal. We even decided to go on a little impromptu date. The best we could do with the time that we had, and the way the world is. But when we were winding down for the night, getting ready to brush our teeth, Charlie informed me that today was Poggers, babe. I politely replied that if he was trying to mess with me, it was going to get old fast. He shook his head. It just came out, I'm sorry," he said, raising the toothbrush and dragging it across his teeth. We both brushed our teeth in unison and spit into the sink. As I was wiping my mouth, I could see Charlie leaning in for a kiss. I turned my head, but when I met him face to face, a putrid smell climbed in my nostrils. It was enough to make me recoil away from him. It was like battery acid poured over rotting beef. I instinctively put my hand over my nose. "Oh, your breath is awful," I told him, which we both knew was odd. He just brushed his teeth, and it's not like he has gingivitis or anything. He went to point out as much by pointing into the sink and stopped. I followed his cue and looked into the sink where he had just spit. On my side of the sink, there was a few lingering bubbles. On his side of the sink, however, still clinging to the white porcelain was a thick, frothy substance. It was sickly yellow with streaks of red that would suggest Charlie's dental hygiene had degraded significantly in just one night. He quickly reached over and turned the faucet on, opening his mouth and checked out the condition of his teeth. They looked completely fine. It took a good bit of water for the mess he had spit out into the sink to budge at all. Eventually, with the convincing of steaming hot water, it disappeared. I went to say something to him, but he was captivated by his reflection with his mouth moving ever so slightly. His lips quietly repeating the p sound over and over. I told him that we should just go to bed and we'll make an appointment to see the dentist. Make sure something weird wasn't going on with bacteria or something. We made our way to be settled down for the night. With the lights turned off and the dark of the sleeping world creeping in, I closed my eyes. I don't know how long I was asleep for, but I was woken up slowly by a small prodding on my shoulder. Charlie was ever so gently poking me, like a child who wants their parent to wake up on Christmas but is too afraid to make them angry. I shuffled my body, still coming out of the throes of deep sleep, that my body was sluggish. The blankets... I shuffled my body, still coming out of the throes of a deep sleep. My body was sluggish, and the blankets felt like they weighed 30 pounds. As I turned over, I reached behind me to flick on the light, and the sudden brightness momentarily stunned my vision. I started wiping my eye and was about to ask what was wrong when a very familiar and pungent smell assaulted my senses again. It was worse this time, like it had been sitting for a while. I struggled to keep my urge to vomit subdued. This was made all the more difficult when I moved to brace my new position and felt my fingers press against the sheets. As my fingers pressed down, a hot and viscous liquid rose from the divots that I made. Then I saw Charlie. His face had the sickly yellow shit caked onto it. He looked like an infant that fought hard against eating his baby formula. His mouth was moving and words were coming out, but just barely. His voice was raspy, and I could tell that they were painful. His body would tremble every time he tried to speak. Such a horrid sight, watching each letter accompanied by a small spittle of the disgusting liquid, and before long I could see how it was about to get worse as he kept going. Poggers. Poggers. I could see thin trails of smoke lifting from inside his mouth and under his lip. Horrified, I hadn't moved my hand yet, but once the new drippings had made their way onto my hand, I could feel the intense burning sensation. Charlie started to shake more violently as I finally snapped to my senses and ran to the phone. Dialing 911 as fast as I could, I heard Charlie behind me, beginning to shout, "Poggers!" over and over. I could just imagine the molten ooze spewing from his mouth like Yellowstone as he attempted to clear his mouth of the heat. I didn't know what to even say at this point to the operator, so I told the lady that he had severe burns and trouble breathing. Keeping the phone off the hook as the operator confirmed that the ambulance was on the way, I made my way back to Charlie. It was so much worse than I saw at first. The blankets on the bed where he was, facing away from me, were soaked. The liquid had saturated the sheets, and the bed at this point, they were beginning to drip onto the hard wood. Plumes of smoke rose from the hard wood, threatening to bore right through the floor, but it wasn't my biggest concern. I couldn't help but picture Charlie laying there all night, saying that stupid word all over, suffering but not wanting to disturb me. He looked so weak. I didn't know what the fluid was, but it was taking all the nutrients Charlie needed to function with it. The whites of his eyes were beginning to stain yellow like a smoker's walls, and his skin was so visibly dry, I thought he was going to start molting. He barely recognized the man that I knew as he rose from the bed, shambling to his feet. It looked like some cheesy zombie flick with a small budget, but seeing it in person, happening to someone I loved, it was so painful and scary. I started to worry about my safety as he got closer to me, the same yellow substance dropping from his slack jaw. His eyes were so different, I felt as though he couldn't even see me. He was just heading towards something. "Poggers," a whisper came from his mouth. Well-formed letters, unfettered by the slob dwelling in his mouth. The voice was ethereal. It didn't even sound like Charlie anymore. Before Charlie closed in, I saw the sanctity of blue and red lights flashing beyond the bedroom window. I quickly ran to the front door, letting paramedics in and trying to explain to them what was going on as we headed upstairs. Charlie looked so weak, but it took 3 of them to subdue him as he fought back, his grotesque saliva burning holes in their clothing, though I don't think they noticed. They made it apparent that I wasn't allowed to go with them as they loaded him into the back of the ambulance. As they drove away, leaving me to my own devices, I could see one of the paramedics pressing a needle into Charlie's neck, and with that, he was gone. I was left standing there, all alone in the dark. Eventually, I made it back upstairs and started cleaning up the mess. Luckily, the piles of vial no longer burned on contact, though the texture was still enough to make me wince. I didn't think there was a point in washing anything, so I just pulled the bed with its covers out into the alleyway and rested them against the garbage. I didn't sleep that night. I was so out of it that I almost didn't hear the phone ringing when someone at the hospital was telling me I could visit. I was there in no time. While looking at Charlie, who was still pretty heavily sedated but conscious, I asked the doctor if Charlie had said anything yet. The doctor said it would be difficult for Charlie to speak as he chewed through his tongue during the night there. Looking at my boyfriend, I could see that even under sedation, his jaw was moving up and down, his lips pursed and contorted as if trying to speak. However, with the drugs and the lack of a tongue, all that came out of his mouth were small whistles of air. As I stared at Charlie, I heard something behind me, a commotion caused by another person being rushed into the ER. Turning around, I saw one of the paramedics that had helped Charlie get into the ambulance and rushing him down the hall. So many people were talking all at once, but I'm sure I must have been the only one to hear it. The ambulance driver speaking low, under the mutter of voices and the chaos of chirping machinery. This is not Poggers.
Thank you.